you will. Yeah.
Okay, we have our next talk is let's talk about it. What is the way forward? Academy of the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, and they will be talking about something that it's been going since 2009, I believe, right? Ever since Mexico.
Oh yeah,
Mexico, right? Okay. So they will be discussing the way how designers and researchers maybe should continue their research and why they should be doing it and how. All right.
Can I have a mic?
No.
Okay, well, you know I'm Mary. My background's in psychology.
And my name is Sofie, and my background is in design.
So if I briefly explain what we plan to do in the session before we launch in, which is that we'll start by introducing a few ideas, and they'll pick up on a lot of what's been mentioned this morning, and actually hope to address some of the questions that have been raised, or rather we'll discuss those questions. We'll then talk about our own research, our collaboration, and then we'll open it to the floor for discussion, which is why this is a long session. We're not going to talk at you for an hour. What we would really like to do is to use the discussion to audio record it, to transcribe it, and to perhaps make it available, publish it in some form. So if you're all happy with that, we'll want you to say who you are and to use the microphone when you ask questions. And if you don't want this to happen, then obviously get in touch with us. And we'll be emailing you with your permission from your email address that the committee has to check that what you said is what you wanted to say and we haven't mistranscribed it. So that's just the mechanics of it. So let's launch in and introduce some of the ideas.
So why do you researchers always compare different typefaces when I as a designer could just tell you which is most legible?
I'm sure that your experience of designing typefaces and using them in your practice makes you well equipped to decide what is more legible and what isn't more legible. But I want to find out about reading, learning how we read, how we process different typefaces, and say you're not right, maybe you don't always get it right.
But why then do you always compare sans and serif typefaces?
Well, it seems like an obvious comparison.
But why does it have to be different typefaces? Why not typefaces of the same family?
Well, I don't really know much about typography.
Well, that's typical.
We're acting.
Okay, so you say that you're looking at understanding how to read, but then you have participants read single letters or words on a screen. What about normal reading situation? What about continuous reading?
Well, the thing about continuous reading is lots of other things come into play. We've already heard this morning that there might be differences in interlinear spacing or line length. And also, we've got top-down influences about understanding the text. And maybe researchers won't show any differences. So what would you think of that if we didn't show any differences when you think things are clearly very different and ought to show differences?
Well, I don't think that there's any need for research because we as designers, we already know best.
Typical. Okay, but we read by identifying single letters. We don't read by word shape, as I think you know.
Oh god, no, not that one again. We heard Kevin Larson talked about this at ATypI 10 years ago, and he also backed it up with loads of scientific findings. But you need to come up with more than that to convince me.
Okay, so what if I come up with something that you don't know, or you don't predict, or that's unexpected? How about that?
Well, you probably use bad test material, and then I'm not going to believe you anyway.
But that's not fair. How do I know what the test material is supposed to be like? I don't know anything about typography.
Then we should collaborate.
Which is what we did. So now we'll describe the work that we've done together in a period when Sofie visited Reading as a researcher. And it's about, or related to, font tuning. We've heard this morning about all the legibility of different typefaces, but what we've got to remember is that when we read, when we identify single letters, we're seeing very many different shapes, very many different forms, very many different typefaces, but what we've got to do is to extract the single letter, the abstract letter, the generic letter. So we've got to know that many different shapes are still an A or a B, etc. And this has been described in terms of font tuning, meaning that we tune into the parameters, in Anne's use of the term, or the stylistic characteristics of that particular typeface. And we then expect the letters that follow to be in that same typeface. So the original work was in the late 1980s, so some time ago, and you'll love this because these are the forms that were used in the research on screen, what was suitable at the time, appropriate at the time. And on the left you see regular forms, regular in the sense that each of the letters are in the same font. And on the right you see mixture of those two forms. And what Sanoki found was that we are quicker at identifying letters if they remain in the same font. So C and D on the right-hand side, it will take longer for us to identify the individual letters because we're having to switch between the different fonts and we're having to retune. So this is a regularity effect. More recently, Peter Walker, a psychologist, used typefaces that might be more like typefaces, but of course these two are very, very different, and we wouldn't expect to see these in reading continuous text. We perhaps wouldn't switch between them within the text part of that. So we felt more had to be done. Of course, there might be a reason, a purpose for slowing down, or it might be useful if we slow down sometimes. And if we start with the dictionary, where we're switching between italic and bold, various different forms, it might actually be helpful to have a slight slowing down because we'll be able to differentiate the different components. We'll be able to perhaps more easily pick out the definition. So maybe that's not always a bad thing. And similarly, in a spread, we might be able to pick out the heading or so on. So there can be a reason that it can be useful. But at other times, it might not be. And maybe if we're switching between various windows, reading online, going to lots of different stories, and we're trying to find something, the fact that we're having to switch between typefaces might be slowing down. So if we're trying to scan and pick something out, we're having to adjust because we've moved from a different typeface. So there is some sort of practical application, I'd like to think, for the research that we're going to describe. As a psychologist, I am interested in why this is happening and when it's happening. And as a typographer...
Yeah, what we wanted to see was to understand what stylistic features actually influence the effect of font tuning. So we took the starting point in this idea put forward by Adrian Frutiger, where he superimposed a range of the typefaces that he views as being some of the typefaces most read. And his idea is that it's a bad resolution here, but his idea is that you can see this the dark area that basically describes the skeleton or the basic skeleton of the letters. So the typeface that we used in this investigation took the starting point in this. I created this on top of the dark area. I created these letters, and this version called neutral was the master font for the other weights that we wanted to compare it with. So the idea was to isolate the stylistic features so that we know which stylistic feature actually causes the effect. So this is the master. Here, yeah, that's the master again. Here's an example of an italic where it's the skeleton that's different. All other parameters are the same, so it has the same contrast, the same weight. In this case, we have the same skeleton, but the only thing that's different is the weight. We also have the same contrast in the stroke. Here, it's the width, the only thing that's different. Now we move on to having two things different. This is the weight and the skeleton. Contrast and weight. And then the last one, weight and width. So here we have all of the different fonts that we tested. So we have the master on top, and then we have three where it's only one feature that's different. And then the lower we have three where there's two different features. So if we look at it here, we have the master in the middle, and on the top we have the three that has one feature different, the bottom two features different, and then you can see there's an interrelation also between the others. So that means that if we look at this one and that one, then we also can see the relationship to that one, because there is only one difference here.
So the reason that Sofie designed all of these was so that we could try to find out what we're tuning to. Are we tuning to the weight? Are we tuning to the width? So we would vary the pairs of fonts that we worked with. So the best thing is to demonstrate what we were doing. So this is the technique which some of you perhaps have heard of, called Rapid Serial Visual Presentation, or RSVP for short. And this is what it looks like. So as you see, there are words. They're each presented in the same place on the screen, which means that we don't have to make eye movements. And what the task that we asked our participants to do was to look at these words and to tell us whether they see a non-word. So a non-word being, as Anne was describing, or a pseudo-word, something that looks like a word but isn't a word. So you need to do this, okay? So all eyes on the screen. Is there a non-word in this sequence, or is there no non-word? Are they all words? No what? Was there a non-word? Hands up if there was a non-word. Hands up if...
know all English words.
Yeah, they are. I forgot to say that bit. Right, hands up if you thought they were all words. Right, ooh,
that's
right.
about half.
Yeah, yeah.
There was English.
Yeah, I know. That's, our participants had English as their first language. Have another go, because I think most of you got that wrong, but I think there was Japsy in there, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Japsy isn't an English word. No, it's not, but it's very plausible. It's absolutely right. Yeah.
Sounds nice.
So Chapsy is a non-word.
It's a non-word. Yeah.
It's a word now.
So you've got another try now. It's going to get a bit faster because basically people had to get something wrong. So you're doing quite well in getting things wrong already. But are you ready? Was there a non-word? Hands up.
Is bushel a word?
Yeah, it is a word. Were they all words, do you think? Yeah, they were all words, I think, on that one. Some of you just won't put your hands up, will you? So this is going to go very well, because we do want some interaction, you know. Okay, now the resolution is poor, but I hope you get an idea of the type of task that we were doing. And we were timing how long it took people to respond. We were also checking whether they got it right or not, but that didn't actually show anything. So all I'm going to show you is how long it took people to respond, their reaction time. Right, this graph is not the wrong way round. The higher bars are taking longer, and that makes sense, okay? So I disagree with that, but we can have that argument a bit later on. So what you see is the number of milliseconds reaction time that it takes people to respond. So the higher ones are slower, And what we've got here is the blue, where all of the words were in the same font. So here they could be in the neutral font, or they could be in the bold expanded font, but they would all be the same. And that's contrasted with the red, where the two were interleaved. So that was the last example that you saw. You saw a neutral, you saw a bold expanded, you saw a neutral. So you see when those two are compared, you're slower when you switch between the fonts. So this is a regularity effect, it's a font tuning effect. We get something similar but not as pronounced when we switch between the neutral version and the expanded version. So we started with these comparisons because we thought they would probably show an effect because they really look rather different. We then went on to a second experiment, and the reason we did these...
Yeah, the reason for these were that these are basically the three fonts that have two stylistic features that are different from the master font. And then we wanted to keep the neutral bold expanded from the previous study in this study to sort of compare the two.
That's right. So once again, we're finding that you're slower switching between neutral and neutral bold expanded. And although small effects, we're getting the same when we switch between neutral and neutral contrast and neutral bold italic. So we haven't finished the whole set yet, so we did another.
So this one included the two remaining fonts that we hadn't looked at yet. And also it was a way of splitting up the neutral bold italic, so having one italic and one bold, and then see if the bold of the italic will influence the findings more than the italic of the bold italic.
And we'll ask you questions on this later on. So what we see if we start on the right-hand side is once again the same pattern. So when we switch between neutral and neutral bold, we're slower at responding than if it was either neutral or neutral bold. Same true for neutral bold italic, but not for italic. We're not slowed down switching between neutral and the italic version. It's slightly the other way around, but don't make anything of that because it's such a small difference. Basically, they're the same. So I thought it might be easier to try and look at these all together. So although this isn't scientifically entirely valid, I think it's just an indication, it's a visualization. And it's showing how much we're slowed down depending on what the pairing is. So you see on the right-hand side, the bold expanded is the one where we're slowed down most when we're switching between that and the neutral, whereas the italics got no effect, and the smaller effects are with the expanded and with the contrast. So there's a pattern there.
I think that's an interesting thing to add here, that when we look at the literature on the reading speed of italic, then generally it's quite slow. But in this situation where it's in combination with the regular, then it doesn't slow down.
And it is possible to analyse this data for legibility effects as well, so we can actually see whether neutral on its own is faster than italic. But I can't remember what that is, so that's for the written paper. So why were we doing this, or what in particular were we thinking after we got these results? I said we were looking at what we tune to and whether we tune to a certain characteristic, so we wanted to know whether it was the degree of difference. So perhaps when we look at these fonts, can we actually say, well, this one is more different, so you're bound to get font tuning, whereas the italic doesn't look so different. So it might be how much difference, but it might be the nature of the difference. So those were the sort of questions we were asking. But we don't know which fonts are more similar to each other. So we asked people. So the participants in our experiments were not designers because we didn't want them muddying the water. We didn't want you lot muddying the water when you did the experiment. So those non-graphic designers were asked after they'd finished to rank the fonts in terms of which was most similar to neutral, number 1. We can argue whether it be 1 or 6, but it was number 1. And what was least similar to neutral. And we also got some designers from Reading and from
Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts
to do to do the ranking as well, to see whether there might be a difference. Not between Reading and Denmark, there was, but we won't go into that. So these are the designers, and here we're seeing it in perhaps not a particularly friendly form, but you're seeing that the italic was perceived as most similar to the neutral bold expanded most dissimilar, most different, and it goes up there with the others in between. But I thought another way of looking at this is just the same data, just the same information, is to do it in terms of space. So here we've got the neutral bold expanded furthest away from the neutral because it's perceived as less similar. So you can see that graphic designers believe that the italic is most similar to neutral, then it goes into the bold, and then the expanded. So now we see the non-designers, the non-graphic designers, a slightly different pattern there, but I should say that people were very different in their judgments. And perhaps if we just look at this and then expand on that. So we've got something slightly different happening in terms of the top ones. And if we put the designers next to the non-designers, you'll perhaps see that it's the designers making italic most similar, perceiving italic to be most similar, judging it to be most similar, whereas people who aren't designers are thinking that the expanded version is most similar.
But I think some things to add here is that the design data was quite, as you mentioned, they didn't agree as much as the non-designers. And one of the reasons probably is that many of them, when I asked them to judge the typefaces against each other, then they said, okay, do you want bold to be the most significant, or do you want italic to be it? So they were more aware of the effect of the different features, and that I couldn't answer because that was what I wanted them to tell me. But I think something else that's also interesting is that both groups actually identify the different in number of stylistic features. So both groups understand that the three italic, bold, expanded only have one difference, and the rest are more different than those.
So then what we needed to do was to put these results together with what we found from the font tuning experiments in order to ask the question, do people's judged similarities actually predict what will happen in terms of tuning? And so we'll put this for the designers first of all. And you see on the right-hand side, italic's gone up above the neutral. That's because of its sort of negative effect. Don't need to spend very long on this because it perhaps take a while to get your head round it. But what we're trying to do here is to see whether the pattern that people predict is borne out by the experiment. And yes, there is some sort of similarity. And if we then look at the non-designers, again there's some similarity, but you might be pleased to know that the designers were slightly better at predicting what happens in terms of font tuning. So their judgments are perhaps, your judgments would perhaps be more refined. So what have we learned? We've already mentioned that there wasn't much consistency. I think I expected more, and particularly among designers, but of course it is that designers will always question, want to know what it is we're looking for. You know, we can't tell you, we're trying to look for it. So that inconsistency means that the ranking is fairly unreliable. But everyone was agreeing that the bold is expanded is most dissimilar, and more subtly, as Sofie mentioned, that when two characteristics were changed, then the fonts appear less similar. What we've also shown is that the typeface changes can slow down word recognition. Now, you'll probably say, well, that's not too surprising, but all of the previous research was based on letters or letter strings. It wasn't on words, so we have introduced something that's slightly more like reading, real reading, or what you might think of as real reading. But there's no effect, already mentioned this, when you switch between the neutral and the italic style. But boldness in particular seems to be very salient and seems to have this effect of slowing down between sort of the lighter version and the bolder version. So I'm calling that a salient characteristic. So we now open the floor to you, and some of the questions you've been asking other speakers, be very happy if you ask them of us. But first of all, we'd like perhaps to get a response to what we've been doing, and you can be as critical as you like, and we'll be as critical back. Please do use the microphone so we can record it, unless you don't want your question to be recorded. And please do say who you are so that we can attribute it to you. And don't use other people's names either, you'll be found out.
Do we have an extra microphone? Or is, is it your phone?
Right, so you're taking this then.
Nothing really to the topic, but Sofie, are you aware that there's already a typeface existing that is called neutral?
Yeah, I am aware of that, and actually for the papers we call it neutral test.
Okay.
So yeah, to distinguish it.
Because,
and for the tape.
And neutral was done by Kai Beier and Susanna Cavalli.
Yeah.
Yeah, and can we
all
have
names correct, yeah.
your name for the tape?
Martin Tiefenthaler, I already told.
Sorry, you said that and I was talking over you. Yeah. There's a question at the front.
You may record it. Okay, so your subject groups were basically graphic designers and non-graphic designers.
Only for the judgments of the similarity.
The similarity.
When we did the experiment with RSVP, they were all non-designers.
Okay, so I'm curious about, how about also adding another factor, like another level of subjects, like the ones who tend to read more on printed medium versus screen. If, I'm sure you guys have thought about that, what kind of like outcomes would that generate?
Right. In talks like this, there is inevitably a question which says, why don't you try this other thing? And I think they're perfectly valid questions. My answer to that is, yes, there might be an overall difference, but why would you predict that, for example, the italic might suddenly show a font tuning effect where it doesn't on screen, or a reader that normally reads on screen would not show an effect, but would show an effect, whereas someone who reads print would. So what I'm saying is, it's an interesting question if you can predict a different pattern of results. If you can only say the people who normally read print would be slower at this because they're not used to reading from screen, then that's not interesting. But if you can say they would come up with qualitatively different results, a different pattern, that is very interesting, and I'd be quite surprised by that result.
I have some data that I can share with you that I've done at Purdue University. It was about librarians versus newspaper editors. Now, librarians tend to read loads of printed medium, right?
Yeah.
And most of the printed medium deals with humanist serif typefaces. So when I tested what type of sensors do they prefer, like what is their inclination, it turned out that they were slightly inclined towards humanist sensors versus grotesque sensors. Whereas newspaper editors, especially since the early 90s, most of them were using Arial. Of course, when it comes to sensors, they used a lot of grotesque sensors because it was available. So this is something that I was.
So what you tested was the preferences, not the performance.
Yeah.
No, yeah, but I was curious if the performance. How do you relate that to?
But I think I agree with Mary. That could probably be interesting to investigate, but it wasn't what we were focusing on here. So that's so there's so many other things that you could look into afterwards also.
And last question: how about trying this performance with oblique rather than italic, right? For instance, with double story. I know it sounds a bit odd, but
well, the reason to include the italic was that the letter shape are different than the regular way. if you just slant the letters, then they would have the same structure, and it would be more like the regular shape. So the intention with the italic was that it should be as different as possible.
To find out.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Did you give your name?
Onur Yazıcıgil.
Oh boy.
Sounds like some sort of...
Great. Wish we hadn't asked that. Oh,
There's one over there.
I always have Paul for the record.
thank you.
I find it very interesting that RSVP results were very similar to the research by Wendt. When you remember that the most striking difference is bold, and in Wendt's graph the bold is much slower read than the normal weights, and the italics behave the same in Wendt. There is a difference, but the difference is much smaller than the difference between normal and bold. So it seems that the results you get through RSVP are similar to the results that Wendt got. But so maybe RSVP is a little bit more reliable than I would expect.
Yeah, I think there is some
designer.
research that suggests.
Yeah, that's interesting to see. But what do you think that you is this about type design, or is this about typography? What you are testing?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Good.
I think we're looking at type design, but the practical implications of it relates to typography. It relates to how we design a spread and how we compose the different styles of typefaces on the spread.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you are. Sorry, you wanted to.
I was just going to say, I think it does relate to type design, but I want you people to think about this and to give me your views on it, because we are trying to work out what stylistic characteristics we tune to. Remember, we've got to translate from these different forms into a generic form. We've got to switch. So when we're reading individual letters, are we setting up certain widths? Are we getting an idea of certain weights? Is it the X height? And so if we get some sort of handle on that, it seems to me that can inform type design. Because otherwise, why do you want to know about how we read? Do you think we should just know? So what does it tell you that we make saccades and all of that? If that isn't informative for you, then there's no point in you knowing any of that, is there? So it seems to me it has some, even though it might be a more fundamental question and get into models of letter identification, it seems to me it can tell type designs quite a lot.
Yes, it tells us, but on the other hand,
there's always a but, isn't there?
Sorry?
Sorry, there's a but. I have that. It tells us a lot. But, and that's what I want to hear, the but.
Yeah, the but is that we would make, as type designers, we would always make an italic and a bold. So there's not really a point to say, from now on I would only make italics because italics...
No, but it's not as straightforward as that. It's far more subtle. It might be...
Yeah.
How much bolder do you go in order to actually create this differentiation that slows you down? Do you want someone to slow down, or do you actually want it to be a smooth read? In which case, yes, it can look slightly different, but not slow down, or it can look more different and slow down. And do I change two stylistic characteristics? So I don't think it's as simple as, do you want an italic?
No, it's not that simple, but maybe one point for further looking into is that I would be interested in the difference between oblique and italic as a second typeface. How do they perform differently? Because when you say when you have the Roman and the italic italic differences by two factors. It's the form and it's the slant. So you were looking at two things and not at one thing. And I think the big point of people like Frutiger was that we only need one thing. We only need the slant, we don't need the other form. That's not what I'm telling, But that is Frudiger said. So that's a question that comes up in type design. What do we really need? And therefore it would be interesting for us as type designers, I think, interesting to see how is this? Was Frudiger right or was he wrong? Does it help? And to what extent? Because traditional typographers who do dictionaries, they say, oh, it's very important. The italic has to really stand out that you really see the difference. And people like Frudiger say, but sometimes you don't need it. But how big is the difference in real? I would like to know that.
I think that would be very interesting and something to look into. Regarding your other point that you actually have two differences there, you could also argue. But the point here was that when you place the two on top of each other, my intention was that they should be as different as possible. But I see your point in you could say that the slant in itself could be a feature. Yeah.
Yeah. Optically correct,
yeah.
Of course. Just okay.
Kevin Larson. So both the designers were able to predict that there would be the smallest font tuning effect between neutral and italic versus neutral and bold, and the quantitative data said there was the least font tuning effect between regular italic versus regular and bold. And this has obvious implications for how we use hierarchy, and italic gets used as a less prominent hierarchy effect than bold does. Could either the designer or the scientist say why that's true? There's only one difference between both neutral
Yes.
and italic and neutral and bold, but...
I'll be the scientist. I've got a slightly uneasy feeling about the bold results because looking on the right-hand side, anything that's bolder is showing greater slowing down. And I don't know if you experienced it when you saw the example, the last example, but there is just a possibility that there's some form of masking going on that I need to explore, meaning that when you get the heavier weight coming after the lighter weight, you lose the lighter weight that came before. But when it's the other way around, you don't. So I'm actually saying, which I shouldn't really do, these results might be an artifact, they might be explained by something else, but designers can now say why they think, because that's an entirely
So the scientific data is congruent with designers' intuition, so I don't think there's any reason to question this effect. It's, why is that effect there? Could we have, is there anything that could say that that effect was going to happen?
I think it could also relate to the amount of black and white on the page, that the more black we have, the more it stands out. I think it could be quite simple that way.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe someone in the audience have a take on that. Always lots.
I am Hans van Manen. I was wondering, is there a difference in order when a non-word was being projected? Is it more difficult to find a neutral non-word after some bold words, or the other way around?
I did look at that because that would either negate, cut out my explanation or not, and I'm afraid it's mixed. So in some cases, and I'd need to look back at my notes to find out, in some cases, yes, the bold coming after a non-word does cause problems, but in other cases it doesn't matter which way around it is. So I'm not too sure there, yeah. And possibility is that people are doing it at all different speeds because we adjust the speed according to how the individual can do it. And it could be that the faster ones are creating more of a problem than the slower ones with the bold. That's great, thank you.
Herr Schweitzberg, Monotype. I'm just wondering, you designed a typeface for this research. So from a perspective, from a statistical standpoint, would it be interesting to just expand your research into a way to analyze or to do the same research with already existing typefaces with a low contrast character, just to see this, that, because even if you design a typeface and just say this is neutral, it's already designed. So
Yeah.
from that
Yeah,
perspective.
obviously it's not neutral at all because it has its style in it, and that I don't believe that's possible. I think that we could obviously use another typeface that has the same different styles that we're looking at. The expanded is very expanded, and that is obviously to get an effect, and it's more than it normally would in a regular typeface. Another issue is also this way we can ensure that participants have the same amount of familiarity with the typeface that they haven't. If we use an existing one, some might have read it quite a lot and others not. So that's also a way of evening out the findings, or the effect on the findings.
Thank you.
I think there was some questions over there.
Well, you guys know who I am, but for everyone else's benefit, I'm Rob Banham from University of Reading. I was just wondering whether it's not the case that the graphic designers' rankings just reflect what we do as typographers, because if you want to make a small change, you go from Roman to italic, and if you want to make a bigger change, you go from Roman to bold. That's just a sort of, that's the convention. And also that maybe there's a link in the results that people are used to changing between neutral and italic much more than they are between neutral and anything else, because in English, if you're reading a book, particularly a scholarly book, the book titles are in italic, and that's a kind of common switch which you're probably more used to than other sorts of switching.
I think you're right in both, and I think the whole that's also why we first time around we only asked non-designers, because in that sense designers are inflicted by we are inflicted by our work, and we can't just judge things neutrally. And the other thing that was about the italic being we're used to switching. I think you're right also in that, and I think this sort of just confirms it, that it works that way.
Yeah, I don't think I can say that doesn't matter, because it will affect the italic and it won't affect the others. So yeah, I think that's a point. And you do all, in a sense, you do all you can to put the person in almost a stressful situation, in a situation where there is you can't think about it, you've just got to, it's quite a sort of a fairly low level thing, not completely, because you do need to recognise the words. So yeah, I guess that could be true.
Thanks. We still have time.
How much time do we have?
You guys have another 10 minutes.
Hi.
Maybe we should move on to
Sorry. I'm Cyrus Highsmith. I think one thing to consider is that when a type designer creates an italic, at the beginning of the process they have to make a decision. Will this italic be used for emphasis within Roman text, or will it be used to set perhaps a whole paragraph or more continuous text, like if you're doing maybe a bilingual document, you do one column in English and one column in Spanish, for example, and that's set in italic. So there are design decisions that go into it that affect how different you might make it from the Roman, or how similar. So not all italics are equal.
Yeah, that's true.
Like the upright versus
Yeah.
the
There are
degrees
loads of
versus-
different ways of italic. I completely agree.
That-
David Petezina, from somewhere. I have. I think this relates to Cyrus Highsmith as well as Albert Jan comment that I think it would be really interesting to see the results in more of a scale. So you would explore how much bold and how much boldness relates to how much readability, and how much italicization relates to how much readability. And also in this sort of what you showed here, we don't know how much italic it was compared to how much bold it was. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it makes completely sense, and that would be a natural follow-up on this study, that we start looking at different grades of extremeness between the because now we pushed it quite far, both in the italic and the bold expanded, and it would be interesting to try out versions in between that and see when it happens and when it doesn't. Yeah.
And I have one more comment.
You need a very sensitive instrument to do that, and I'm hoping that our RSVP is, but I agree with you, yeah.
All right. And about the italic, I have a sense, I do the multi-script design, so I have a sense of italic being sort of different script, and therefore it might be neutral to us as much as the upright is. So that's why probably you didn't see any significant result there, because it was totally different beast you were testing with. It would be like testing, okay, how quickly you read the Latin, how quickly you read the Greek.
I don't think so, because if it really is a different beast, then that changing to the other beast should slow down.
What I think is different is the angle there. So I totally agree there, and we might be indifferent to that maybe because we are used to reading slanted stuff. We read it all the time, like in our handwriting and so on. But I think there might be we are so used to these forms which are different that they are not different, that they don't make any difference in the performance. That's the.
Yeah, I just think we've got to remember these aren't testing the absolute legibility of each of the fonts, even though the data is there to look at. So we really are trying to see, is there a problem in switching? But I do take on board what you're saying. Yeah, I'm just not too sure that it actually fits with this.
I'm not either.
But it's great because these are things that we can carry on and think about, especially when we've got it all transcribed.
Yeah. That was the question up here.
Yeah.
Can we go back to questions to the audience? One, please.
Oh, that was that.
The question has already partly been answered. There is an interesting case to be found in Dutch type design, where Bram de Does, for his lexicon, as the name already suggests, designed especially for dictionaries and similar books. He designed his italic much narrower than is usual for an italic, and the reason he did that was to slow down reading consciously for certain kinds of information. When you compare an italic of regular width with the legibility of a narrower italic, could your RSVP model bring a difference to the surface?
That's a possibility, and we could test just that. The way we've got it designed at the moment, we would be testing whether adjusting our width in the same way like we've done the expanded, when we're identifying letters, is there a problem in switching the width? But we could also do the straightforward legibility of the two italics.
Yeah, because if your RSVP model, isn't that a letter combination which you often find at the bottom of invitations?
Yes, it is as well.
Yes.
That's why it was called that, isn't it?
I see, very clever. But if your RSVP model is able to give answers to questions that refer to subtleties such as these, I think you can look forward to the cooperation of designers, certainly. And when
Can we have a show of hands on that? Because I think we really expected to have you cannot use RSVP, don't be ridiculous, it's got nothing to do with normal reading. So we've got your vote.
Yes,
So how many
at least-
believe
at
in this way of
least,
testing?
in principle. But and then questions to the audience number 2.
Oh, number 2, sorry.
Yeah, what methods are acceptable to you? I think any method, as far as you don't use brute force to extract information, but any method that could bring to the surface pointers for us designers that show us how to improve the performance of everyday letter forms, that would be that kind of information would be most welcome.
Thank you.
And for the record, I'm Jared Unger from the Netherlands.
Thank you.
Definitely not somewhere.
I wonder if there's anyone that has a different view on that, so I'm actually looking for anyone. Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Andrew Barker. All I was wondering was, is there a more naturalistic way of finding out the same things, testing in a way that has more apparent connectedness to how people actually read when they're really reading rather than in a test situation?
That's a key question, and I'd say the answer is no, otherwise we would be doing it. But it's essentially needing to abstract the particular things that you're looking for, that the letter identification, or in this case, going a bit further with the word.
And to answer one of the first questions to the audience about why as designers it might be relevant to us, this sort of work. As a designer it's relevant to me because sometimes my clients will say things to me like, you know, you've done it like that, why have you done it like that? If I have evidence to prove why a certain solution we believe works better, then a client is more likely to accept what I say rather than me being a high-handed, empty-headed designer just saying because I say so.
So that's a plus for research in general.
Yes.
I guess can you see how this type of research can be sort of made into something practically relevant, and hopefully you can.
The missing link is quite often it's difficult for designers to access that research that's done. That seems to be the problem that's been stopping me getting hold of a lot of that research up to now.
My name is Britt Meurik, I'm here from the Netherlands, and I have a question, or not even really a question, but I would like to zoom out at this moment, because I think the combination of scientists and designers is very interesting. But I also noticed there's a lack of understanding for each other in a specific way. How did you experience that, and how did the collaboration between you two enrich the research?
You start.
Well, I think it's with the two of us, it's not as difficult as it would with maybe others of the same fields, because although I have a background in design, I've read quite a lot of psychology papers, and Mary is based in a typography department, so she knows quite a lot of of how typography works. So I think it was quite easy to meet, and I think also one of the sort of the good things about our collaboration is that none of us doubt what we should look into. We know which area of the research sort of belongs to our field. So that way we never really step on each other's toes, I think.
Yeah, and I think I'd add that one of the things I've learned, and I think it's taken a while, is that what you don't do is to criticise the other discipline, the other way of thinking, from your own perspective. You try and do it from that perspective, which has different objectives and different ideals. Because it seems to me a lot is written about this great gap. And I've just read a PhD thesis which is doing just that. And you can just discount what other people say if you don't think, now they had a reason for that and they're doing it in that way. I might not think that's quite right, but I want to understand it. And I think the more, because we were able to discuss things a lot, then I think you do start to learn the other perspective. So it worked for us, we think. Someone at the back.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I just have a question concerning what methods are acceptable to you. I came in a few minutes late, so I hope this isn't stupid what I'm saying. If I was doing this sort of research, I would naturally default to something like self-paced reading probably, and not RSVP. And I was just wondering what made you decide to
So
go...
what did you say first? Reading?
Self-paced reading.
Okay, yeah.
Should I explain what that is? So you see a word, the experimental person sees a word, and then it pushes a button when it's done reading, when they're done reading, and then the next word appears, and then they push the button again, and the next word appears.
How do you know that they've read the word?
They know that they've read the word. They push the button. It's
why do you believe that they've read the word?
They have a button, and they're like, I read this word, I'm ready for the next word.
Yeah.
It could become a reflex.
And then the next word appears.
Sometimes I read whole paragraphs and I haven't got a clue what they're about.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you can.
Yeah, that is a word.
Sure that RSVP will make sure that they will do that exact thing.
That's all right with RSVP, because the whole thing is that we're looking at the accuracy as well. So it makes sure that actually the words have been seen and recognised or not recognised. You're shaking your head, but it does, because if they were all incorrect answers, I wouldn't just have shown you the reaction time data. There isn't. So I understand what you're saying, that the person presses that, but you can't know unless you're measuring their remembering certain words that were in that. Are you checking?
I didn't make this method up. I mean, self-paced reading is used a lot. I mean, I didn't just make this up and I'm like, this is going to work. But it does show slowing down effects in other cases. So it is being used in other research. And I'm just answering to the question. What?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But I think another problem with the method you're suggesting is that it is possible to cheat. And
it's always possible to cheat.
No, it's not always possible to cheat.
No.
Well, if you have to answer, did you see a word or not, then you can't cheat on that, because
you can ask these questions with.
Although you saw there was an unword, you can still cheat and say you can lie.
But then you have a 50% chance of hitting right.
We know if you if you did it with your eyes shut, you get 50% correct. Our people didn't get 50% correct.
The paragraph versus word is a different issue. I mean, the way how you grasp the content, the context is a different world.
I shouldn't have said that. Yes, I shouldn't have. But it was really getting at the point that you. Oh, sorry. I shouldn't have introduced the idea of reading a paragraph of text, but I just wanted to get across the idea that you can perhaps delude yourself into thinking that you've read a word and press the key, but. Yeah, as you said, you need some sort of check that those have been read. But I don't see that that's so... It's a bit more like reading, but it's not very much more like reading than RSVP, is it, if it's word by word?
Yes, it's... you don't have, you can't go back with your saccades and all that, so it's not 100% natural. I just think that it nicely shows effects of being slowed down. Like if you have a sentence and you switch to bold in the middle of the sentence, and even if the person in the experiment is like in a rhythm and keeps pushing, push, you will see the effect like 3 words down the line. You can still get that effect though, because they stop and they're like, oops, I still need to process that word a little bit more. I kind of saw it, but I didn't really read it. And you see those effects.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. I think that there's one question, and then maybe we're out of time.
No, we still just have... Let's have this last 2, okay?
When thinking about issues about legibility, the first thing that comes to my mind as always is the issue that we have been tinkering with letter forms for, let's say, 2,500 years. And we're trying things out, and sometimes we've radically changed the appearance of the letters for ideological or theological reasons of trying to construct empires or be subversive. But we still circling around certain shapes, certain proportions, as Albert Jan Paul has made abundantly clear. So when you start out to become a researcher in the field of legibility, how do you cope with that?
I can't answer that.
Oh, my name is Jelle Bosman.
Thank you.
I think what is interesting is that today we have so many different medias we read from. In the beginning, when we start reading, there was very few medias, and now we have there's so many type are used in so many different situations, and that's why we need to know more about it. That's what motivates me. And the last question,
yes,
sorry.
Hello, Rainer Erich Scheichelbauer of GlyphsApp and Typographic Society of Austria. I think what Sonja was talking about before is the preoccupation with reading speed in terms of measuring performance, which is not necessarily the goal of reading to be as quick as possible, and the underlying assumption that quicker speeds is better performance, which maybe I don't want the quickest font or letter. Maybe I want one that reads nicely when I read it slowly.
Absolutely, and I think that's a valid criticism from a designer's point of view. This was measuring speed, but it wasn't really measuring the speed that we read different fonts. So it was trying to pick up this, when something changes a bit, it causes, in the same way as you mentioned with the self-paced reading. So I think it's slightly different from that. But what's helpful is you voicing this concern that speed is an issue, and therefore perhaps need to be careful about how we explain what significance the speed has.
That's the second question.
Right, yes. So speed is not, on its own, is not an acceptable.
So the scientist's focus on speed is not necessarily what I as a typographer or type designer aim for. So that if you constantly aim at speed.
I think that's.
You could please repeat yourself.
Yeah. So that, which are something that I often see in scientific papers on readability, is that focus on speed. Not all of them, but many. Right? And maybe that focus on speed, and speed being the performance measurement, is not necessarily what I aim for as a typographer or a type designer at all. So that so while you're measuring speed, this might become totally irrelevant to us as designers.
Right, I would just say that if there's a problem in recognising something, that will slow you down. So yeah, it's not speed per se, but it's indicative of an issue that's a difficulty in letter identification. And whilst you might want the more comfortable experience, I think you have a more comfortable experience if you're not slowed down in working out what a letter is.
Okay. Very nice. This could be slightly irrelevant. If it is, you may just disregard it. But I'm curious about one little thing. Do you have a subtle assumption that people perform best at what they prefer?
I have no idea.
No, I don't. No.
That's the answer.
Maybe.
Okay. So there's, you think, no links, maybe, right?
That might affect their motivation in an experimental task, which I suppose is a yes. But given that people are sitting through a whole lot of things coming up on the screen, I think maybe not.
Okay, all right. Let's wrap it up, and we have a lunch break, and afterwards we will have Nadine Shahin. And thank you very much, Mary. And
thank you all. It wouldn't have been